Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining me. Today we are doing the second part in our series on Napoleon's Guard, and today we're going to be looking at the light cavalry. Now there were several different regiments and many of them went back to long before the Empire, when Napoleon was still a general, long before he was anywhere near the crown, but the same spirit was carried on from the sands of Egypt through to the field of Waterloo, and those light cavalry really add a touch of elan and class to Napoleon's Imperial Guard. So the first regiment we're going to talk about are the Chasse à Cheval de la Garde. So that's of course the Chasse à Cheval of the Guard, for those of you who would rather I didn't try to pronounce it in French. Now, most chasseur units in the French army, and they were the most numerous of all the different kinds of cavalry. We don't see them very much on the battlefields of Wargamers so much, and it's for a very good reason. They wore very drab uniforms. It's dark green jacket. They wore dark green overalls often, and they didn't have the brightly coloured uniforms that the Hussars had, despite performing pretty much the same role. I know for myself personally, if I have to use either chasseurs or hussars, as for argument's sake the light cavalry of a division, then I much rather use hussars, and even to the extent that I'll say these are chasseurs but I'm using hussar figures just because they look a lot brighter. The Chasse à Cheval of the Guard don't have this problem though. They wore uniforms in the hussar style, so they had the pelisses over their shoulders, which is kind of like, it's like an overcoat but very richly coloured. Theirs were red, and their outfits were green. Now, some of you may have seen Napoleon wearing a green coat quite a lot. It was one of his favourite uniforms, and that was a uniform of the colonel of the Chasse à Cheval. So they were actually one of his favourite units. That's a great symbol to show when you're wearing their uniform. They came about very, very early on in Napoleon's career, perhaps as a result of an incident in 1796 in Borgetto, where Napoleon was having lunch with, I think it was Murat. He was having lunch anyway, and a group of Austrian hussars showed up. There was no one in the way, no one protecting him, no guard or anything. So he had to scramble out to escape. He climbed over a wall, and he lost one of his boots in the process of doing it. So I think this probably led to him thinking, I might have to do with some troops that hang around me and keep me safe. And the result of that was him founding a cavalry regiment, which were known as the Company of Guides. So this Company of Guides were obviously very richly dressed. They were designed to show the prestige of the young General Bonaparte, and he was not exactly the shy and retiring type. They joined him when he went on his Egyptian campaign, and their crazy uniforms, for the time certainly, really led them to being very popular in paintings and the imagination of the French public back home. Bonaparte himself described them as being daredevils, well-mounted and brave, and they were being compared on that Egyptian campaign to another kind of cavalry, which I'm holding back because they are some of my absolute favourite troops from the Napoleonic Wars. I know I say this pretty much every video, but these guys are definitely up there. In fact, I'm going to do a video on my favourite units of the Napoleonic Wars, but these guys, expect them to be in the top 3. I'll come to them later on. That I'm keeping you in a bit of suspense. So anyway, the Garde chasseurs, as they became after the founding of the Imperial Guard, after the coronation of the Emperor, they were used as bodyguards for Napoleon. They would be close protection troops. There would be a troop that was on duty as his bodyguard, so you would have like a troop of the day. Now that changed later when more and more cavalry regiments were founded. I'm going to talk a bit more about that when I talk about a famous action of one of them. But in the early days, the Chasse à Cheval were the personal guard of Napoleon himself, and nowhere was this more explicitly shown than during the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. The Russian cavalry, the Russian Guard actually, delivered a charge which was seen to be the one that would break the back of the French. and the Chasse Cheval launched that counter-charge. Now, it wasn't completely successful. They stopped the breakthrough, so they achieved their aim, but they took a lot of casualties doing it. That said, they were against the absolute cream of the Russian cavalry. Russian cavalry is not necessarily known as being the best in the world, but it's not bad. And the Garde Russian cavalry were the best of not bad cavalry. So, no mean feats there. They were quite swaggering, very boastful. They were basically hussars. Although they were called chasseurs, they were in temperament like hussars. And if you've seen the video on hussars, you'll see that hussars tended to be a lot more independent-minded. They tended to be a lot less rigid in their authority. One of the nicknames for the Chasse Cheval were the Spoiled Brats, and that was the name given to them by the rest of the army. Marshal Bezier actually had to reprimand a number of them because they wouldn't salute senior officers. They used to smoke pipes whilst on guard duty. They were basically just in it for the swagger and the uniforms. Now, they lived up to it. They were not bad troops by any stretch of the imagination, but they certainly weren't the stoic figures of the Imperial Guard infantry, or perhaps the Grenadier à Cheval, or some more of the heavy cavalry. They were very much in the hussar spirit. I think General Lasalle would have absolutely loved hanging out with the Chasse Cheval. In black powder terms, they are, of course, in Albion Triumphant Volume 2. They're in Clash of Eagles as well. And in the rules, they are effectively slightly better hussars. They have a better hand-to-hand rating. They are 7 instead of 6. And they are reliable. They keep the Marauder special rule as well, as all hussars or chasseurs do. Reliable certainly helps them. That seems to be a general rule for all of Napoleon's Guard. And yeah, it sounds reasonable to me. I think if you were to do maybe an 1805 or earlier supplement, they could perhaps have Tough Fighter as well. I don't think that would necessarily be beyond the realms of acceptability. But by and large, yeah, I think they do a pretty good job of representing the Chasse Cheval. They're effectively slightly better hussars, and I think that's fair enough, to be honest. So, speaking of the Consular Guard, I mentioned that they fought some troops over in Egypt. Those troops were later added to the Imperial Guard as well. Well, some of them were, not all of them. And they were the Mamelukes, or the Mamluks, as they're sometimes known. Now, these were troops that were natives of Egypt. They were part of the Ottoman Empire, but not really part of the Ottoman Empire. They were originally slaves who rose up against the Ottomans, and they eventually ruled Egypt for themselves. Now, the Mamelukes were incredibly well dressed. They'd be wearing silks. They were armed with beautifully bejeweled pistols and curved sabres. All that kind of stuff that you think of when you think of the exotic Middle East. That's these guys. Their uniform was pretty much whatever they wanted to wear. It was often baggy pantaloons and a sort of jacket top. They'd wear turbans as well. Now, as the wars went on, the number of Mamelukes went down, as I'm sure you can imagine. There was a very limited supply of them. But originally, they were all Egyptian soldiers. Well, I say Egyptian. They were from the western end of the Ottoman Empire. So there'd be some Greeks in there, some Croats, etc. But all the troops were Ottoman Mamelukes. The officers were often French. Jean Rapp was to become their colonel. He was one of the senior commanders over in Egypt. So they were started off as a unit that were added merely to improve the prestige of Napoleon. Really fascinating unit. I don't see that much about them in English. There may be more in French. I don't know. My French is as I'm sure you can tell, not great. But they have an interesting pedigree, shall we say. They were used in Spain. Now, when you have Muslim troops fighting for a conquest of Spain, that brings up very different memories to what we have in Britain, where I live, or perhaps America or Australia. We think, well, you know, what does it matter? They were French troops. They were fighting for Napoleon. They were trying to invade. This is a country that only 300 years before had finally thrown the Muslims, or as they would see it, the Moors, out of Spain. it was only then that they had finished that Holy Crusade that was begun in the 11th century. Now, I'm not saying that this is right or wrong. I'm saying this is how many Spaniards at the time saw it. They saw Napoleon bringing the forces of Islam to Spain. Now, as it was, he had about 200 of these Mamelukes, but that's not the point. The point was the symbolism of it. There was a riot in Madrid, and it was put down using Mameluke troops. Now, it may have been that they were just the troops on hand. They obviously were around Napoleon, but the fact that it was Muslim Mamelukes that were used caused huge problems for the Spanish, and that really did help the galvanization of the Spanish civilians into forming those guerrilla bands. And it really meant that the Catholic Church now had a reason to get behind the uprising, more so than the ungodly Napoleon, things like that. It turned it from a, well, we don't really like this guy, into a, we are now fighting for Christ. It had that added religious dimension. Now, we're kind of getting off what the Mamelukes were. I just wanted to point that out because I think it's quite an interesting effect of having, Napoleon thought these guys looked cool. He thought by having real savages, as they would have seen them at the time, under his command, enhanced his prestige. But it can also cause huge problems like it did in Spain as well. So he had a squadron of these guys. As I say, they wore pretty much their own outfits. They were kind of part of the Guard and not. They were almost like a curiosity, almost like mascots. Now, they did charge, they did fight. Don't get me wrong. They were not popinjays. They were proper soldiers, but they weren't really used that often. Like I said, they were used in Spain, and that was pretty much it, really. There was a squadron around him at Austerlitz. They used them there. But, that was about it, really. They were founded in 1802, and by 1805, the Russians were quite wary of them. Now, the Russians, of course, had been fighting the Ottomans down in the south of their empire for quite a while, and they realised how good these Mameluke troops were. As skirmishing light cavalry, they really were very, very good. They're not necessarily hugely important in the Napoleonic Wars. In Black Powder, in fact, they don't really get their own special rules. They do in Albion Triumphant Volume 1, but in Clash of Eagles, they're just lumped in with any other French light cavalry. In Clash of Eagles, they're also the same as the Chasse or Cheval of the Garde, so it's that hussar with an extra attack and reliable. And I think that's fair enough. As much as I love them, and I love them for what they bring to a Napoleonic battlefield and the period in general, they're effectively just a squadron or two squadrons, perhaps, of well-dressed hussars. Well, we've talked about the two hussar-esque units, I guess we could call them, and now we're going to go on to two different types of unit. And again, I'm sorry to say, they're some of my favourite regiments in the Napoleonic Wars. They are the Lancers. Now, there's 3 regiments of Lancers. The first and third are the Polish Lancers, and the second are the Dutch Lancers. Now, the first regiment was effectively part of the Old Guard. The second regiment, the Dutch Lancers, was part of the Middle Guard, and the third regiment, which was the second, the Polish one, just to be confusing, they were part of the Young Guard. This is all sort of, it doesn't really matter hugely because they wouldn't be brigaded with the infantry units anyway. They would be in their own light cavalry brigades. So, the Polish Lancer, one of the iconic soldiers of the history of warfare. A direct descendant of the Polish winged hussar. A Polish Lancer was a man who used their own traditions to start off with to really reintroduce the lance into Europe. Now, I have heard this story before. I think I've mentioned it in another video. I'm not 100% certain how true it is, that the Polish light cavalry were originally not armed with lancers. They were originally armed with sabres. They were fighting against some Spanish lancers. And the Spanish lancers, as was perhaps their wont, decided to run away. They dropped their lancers to do so, and the Poles picked them up. Seeing this, and the effectiveness that the Poles had with them, the Napoleon then issued orders to issue them with lancers. I have also heard this story where instead of Spanish lancers, it was in fact Austrian Uhlans. I don't know how true that is, that's the myth. It sounds a little bit too on the nose to be true, but, you know, it could well be, It was during their service in Spain that they were elevated to the Imperial Guard. They fought at Madrid alongside the Mamelukes, as we spoke about earlier on. But they really became famous as a very little known battle called Somo Sierra. It was basically a ravine that the French army had to go up, and at the top were the Spanish defending it. Marshal Victor was the man in charge of trying to force the ravine, and he was up against about 12,000 Spaniards and 4 artillery batteries. And he was sort of, going up there, and the Spanish were pouring fire down and canister and all that kind of good stuff. And Napoleon basically turned to the guys to the left of him and said, "Can't anyone do something about this?" It was a bit of a, will no one rid me of this troublesome priest moment. So the Polish colonel, who heard this, took that to be, you do something about it. So him and what's known as the duty squadron, so I mentioned earlier on that the Chasse Cheval would be the personal guard of Napoleon. That was true in the early days. A bit later on, it would rotate around the different regiments. And this day it happened to be a squadron of these Polish lancers. So this squadron, 150 Polish lancers, charged up the ravine towards the enemy positions. Picture the scene. You've got a very narrow, rocky valley. Either side, you've got wounded Frenchmen staggering back from Marshal Victor's earlier assault. And then through it just blows 150 Polish troops. They got to the top of the hill and they sabred the artillery. They went into the infantry. These 150 men broke 12,000 Spanish defenders who were uphill in a defended position. Absolutely incredible. The bravery of these men cannot be underestimated. I think I read that 3 of them remained unwounded. The colonel was killed. It was an absolutely crazy charge, and I'm not sure any troops in the world, maybe the British heavy cavalry, could have done this. It's an absolute marvel of the Napoleonic period, and it's not that well known a battle. I'm going to do a whole episode on it in the future because I think it deserves to be better known. But the bare bones here are 12,000 Spaniards, uphill, defended position, versus 150 Polish light cavalry, and the Polish light cavalry won. It's an incredible story. But I'll just leave you with a quote from an eyewitness of the assault. Writing later, he said, "We charged at full speed. I was about 10 paces in front with my head bent down, uttering our war cry by way of distracting my attention from the din of the enemy's fire, which was all breaking out at once, and in the infernal hiss of their bullets and grape shot. Our warlike cries were becoming lost in the cries of pain of the unfortunate Poles. I did not dare to turn my head, fearing that the sad spectacle would cause me to give up. One officer alone was following me, Radowski, I believe, a colossus, like most of these picked men. He was still on horseback, but wounded to death, staggering, and on the point of falling off with his face to the enemy. Nearly the whole squadron was laid low. 20 alone had escaped this massacre safe and sound. These had assisted their wounded to retire, so that over the whole of the remaining ground I saw covered by our charge. I only saw one trumpeter left standing, motionless, in the midst of the firing which was still going on. The poor child was weeping for his squadron." As I say, they really are a phenomenal formation. I'm going to do a video entirely on them. They're something special in warfare. We talk about, these units, the Theban Sacred Band, or the Praetorian Guard, these super elite units whose name has gone down throughout history. And I think from the Napoleonic Wars, that's often the Old Guard. I think the Polish Lancers, for me, are something special, something unique in those Napoleonic Wars. In 1814, when Napoleon surrendered and resigned for the first time, he was permitted a guard to join him on Elba. It was 500 infantrymen and 120 cavalry. He was allowed some artillery as well. And the regiment of Polish lancers actually started moving towards Fontainebleau without orders because they all wanted to serve with the Emperor on Elba. Many of the officers, and I'm talking senior officers here, brigadiers, colonels, they were willing to serve as privates as long as they were allowed to accompany the Emperor to Elba. Krasinski, one of the officers, wore his parade uniform, and he's quoted as saying, "God has visited misfortunes upon the Emperor," and they all began to weep. They regretted that they had not all been killed before hearing that anyone had dared demand Napoleon's abdication. Loud cries for vengeance were heard along with "Vive l'Empereur!" Lancers were raised, and as they passed through Nainville, before Sebastiani's ADC halted them, Krasinski galloped off to headquarters to protest that his duty and honour called him to Napoleon's side, for it was not to France, but to Napoleon himself that the Lancers had pledged their lives. It's a truly, truly impressive unit, and I want to do a whole video on it. There's so much more I want to say about them, but I'm aware that this is a video on the Guard light cavalry in general. So that's the first regiment of the Polish Lancers. The second regiment were Dutch Lancers, sometimes called Red Lancers, because they wore red uniforms. Shockingly enough, the Polish ones wore like a dark blue. The Dutch wore red. They weren't quite as natural horsemen as the Poles. During the retreat from Moscow in 1812, the Polish Lancers would roughshod their horses, and by the time they got back to the rest of the army, they'd saved 200 horses, which on the retreat from Moscow was pretty impressive. The Dutch Lancers, however, they didn't go with that practice, and they didn't have any horses when they returned. Despite being as brave and as well uniformed as the Poles, I don't think the Dutch Lancers quite had the natural sort of folk memory, I guess you could say, of the Polish Lancer. They didn't have that tradition of light cavalry skirmishing, of the elan, of the almost joie de vivre that the Poles had. The Poles are quite interesting peoples, certainly in the Napoleonic period. They're very French in their outlook. It's an interesting one, which I don't think is really worth going into here, about national characteristics. But the Dutch Lancers were certainly very good. They fought at Waterloo as well. I'm going to summarise at the end with their Waterloo performance. Not quite as fanatically loyal as the Polish Lancers, though. And as I said earlier on, they were, on paper, part of the middle guard, so not quite as senior as the Poles either. So at Waterloo, how did the Lancers do? Well, pretty well. The Dutch Lancers routed the British cavalry in association with the Poles. The famous scene from the film Waterloo, and the painting by Lady Elizabeth Butler. The Scots Greys charged in, absolutely massacred the Erlon's corps, but being British, they went too far, and that was when the Guard Lancers charged back. There's a great shot in Waterloo, I'll try and get it on the screen if I can, when the Polish Lancers actually chase down some British generals, and they get stuck in the mud, and they are lanced to death. It's the Lancers are a funny one. Even at the time, they were seen as being something different. When you're a British cavalryman, you know what a dragoon is, you know what a cuirassier is, you're used to fighting them, you fought their ilk all the time, you've hung around with them, that's fine, you know what they are. A Lancer, however, like I say, there's a certain cachet to that phrase, and it was often talked about that a Lancer, you just had to get past the point, and then it was like killing rabbits. Well, okay, yeah, that's fine, but you've got to get past that point. In Black Powder, they have the Lancer special rule, obviously, and they also have Reliable and Marauder, the same as all the other light cavalry. I think that does the Polish light cavalry in particular a huge disservice. Polish infantry in Albion Triumphant Volume 1 and in Clash of Eagles both get Tough Fighter. I can see absolutely no reason that the Poles wouldn't get that. I also think they could have Stubborn as well. They could perhaps re-roll those failed morale saves, because when you've got 150 of them taking on 12,000 Spaniards and they keep on going, well, like I say, that didn't happen every day, but it's more about the way of warfare, the mentality of the Polish troops, I think, that made them so good. So I think having a Polish Cheval Léger, the same as a Chasse à Cheval, just with a pointy stick, I think that does the Poles a disservice there. So that pretty much sums up the light cavalry of the Imperial Guard. There were two more types of unit. There were the Scouts and the Honour Guard, but they weren't really used in combat very much, so I don't really want to spend too much time talking about them. There's no rules for them in Black Powder, So I think you'd either just use regular light cavalry rules, or really they'd be attached to other squadrons, particularly the Grenadier à Cheval or the 1st Regiment of Polish Lancers. So you wouldn't necessarily really have them as separate units anyway. So that's been a quick gallop, pun intended, through the Imperial Guard light cavalry. 2 of my most favourite all-time Napoleonic regiments involved in there. Really good. I don't think Black Powder does a particularly good job of distinguishing them from other light cavalry, particularly when it comes to the Poles and the Dutch. I think they need a couple more special rules just to give them that extra something that they require to match their reputation, and also on the tabletop so they can stand up against those British cavalry units, because at the moment I think they'd struggle, to be honest. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and maybe sharing it on social media. If you didn't like the video, well, thank you for making it this far anyway. I hope you at least enjoyed the pictures. For those of you who are on Facebook, I've set up a Facebook page to accompany this YouTube channel. I got to the stage where I was like spamming a load of wargaming groups and things like that, and I thought it was a little bit unfair on them. So please look for Napoleonic Wargaming YouTube channel on Facebook. You'll find the picture of LaSalle, the same as I've got for the channel. Join me there, and that's where I'll be making all the announcements and things like that. It seems that we've had a bit of a spurt of growth in the last couple of weeks, so thank you very much for that, and hello to all those new subscribers. I hope you can catch me next time. Thank you very much. Goodbye.